Hello, I hope this story touches you and makes you think. Write your feedback and subscribe to the channel. It is very important. John came home after a long day at work. As usual, he put his leather bag by the door and headed to the kitchen. The coffee he made was supposed to be a comfort, but this time it tasted bitter. Something was bothering him. His daughter Sarah had been a bit distant lately, as she used to call every day, sharing news and asking for advice. Now her calls were rare, and she sounded inexplicably tense. Maybe it's just work, John thought, but something in him whispered that it wasn't. The doorbell rang. John opened it and saw the postman handing him a gold embossed envelope. He opened it, and his heart sank. It was a wedding invitation. We invite you to celebrate the marriage of Michael and Sarah. Michael and Sarah, John read aloud, not believing his eyes. Michael had been his best friend for over 20 years. They'd been through ups and downs together, supporting each other in the most difficult moments. But why was his name next to his daughter's? John grabbed the phone and called Sarah. She answered almost immediately, but her voice sounded uncertain. Dad, she began. Sarah, what is this invitation? Is there some kind of mistake? John asked, trying to hide his anger. Dad, no. Michael and I got married last month, she replied, her voice trembling. John felt like the floor was slipping out from under him. You mean you married my best friend and I'm the last to know? His voice rose. Dad, we didn't know how to tell you. Sarah tried to defend herself. You didn't know how to tell me. You both betrayed me. John threw the phone on the table, not listening to further explanations. He sat in silence for a long time, trying to collect his thoughts. If his best friend, whom he considered a brother, and his daughter, whom he had always supported, were now connected by something John could not understand. The next morning, John sat in his favorite chair looking at a photo of him and Michael when they were young. They were in their early 30s, celebrating the opening of their own business together. Michael has always been more than a friend to me, John thought. He was my rock when my wife passed away. How could he do this to me? And he remembered how Michael would often stop by their house, bring gifts for Sarah, and stay for dinner. At the time, it seemed like a normal friendship, but now it was different. John couldn't be alone with his thoughts, so he decided to share everything with his neighbor Judith, who was an old friend. It's like a stab in the back, Judith, he said. Michael knew me, knew how important Sarah was to me. And yet he kept it from me. Have you talked to him? Judith asked. No, I can't. What would I tell him that I feel betrayed? John replied. That evening, Michael suddenly appeared at John's house. John, we need to talk, he said, standing on the doorstep. Don't think it's a little late for that, John replied coldly. I know how it looks, but Sarah and I didn't mean to offend you. Michael began. No, you didn't mean to offend me. You kept it from me, John replied sharply. You didn't even think about how I would feel. Michael tried to explain, but John wouldn't listen. The next day, Sarah came to see John. She looked worried but composed. Dad, I know how this looks, but I love Michael, she said. You do? He's my best friend, Sarah. How'd you do this? John replied, his voice rising. We didn't want to hide it, but we were afraid of your reaction, she defended herself. Afraid? Maybe because you knew it was wrong, John asked sharply. John felt like he was losing control of the situation. Sarah tried to explain that their love was real, but to John it sounded like a betrayal on both sides. You've always been my rock, Sarah. How can I trust you now? He said. Dad, I'm still your daughter, and I want you to understand me, she said. After talking to Sarah, John was alone in his room. His head was heavy with thoughts. His daughter had always been the closest person to him after his wife's death. How could she do this? He thought aloud. He knew that only a calm conversation would help him find answers. But would he be able to speak without raising his voice? John remembered how little Sarah used to run around in the garden, how he had taught her to ride a bike. She had always been honest and open. What had changed? Why couldn't she tell me? John asked himself. He realized that maybe she was afraid of his reaction, but that did not justify the lie. John called his daughter and asked her to meet him at a cafe where they had often eaten when she was a teenager. Sarah agreed, though she sounded anxious. Thank you for coming, John began as they sat down at a table. Dad, I know you're in pain, she replied. A pain is one thing, but I want to understand, John said. Sarah began to talk. Michael was always there for me. He helped me when I felt lonely, and you were busy and I didn't want to bother you, she said. Are you saying it's my fault? John was outraged. No, Dad, it's not. It's just, I didn't plan it. But my feelings for Michael were real, she replied, trying not to cry. Tell me, Sarah, how long did it last? John asked. How about a year? She answered quietly. And you didn't say anything all this time. His voice trembled. We didn't know how you would react. We were afraid of losing you, Sarah said. John felt his anger gradually give way to sadness. I can't say I understand you, he said, but I do want to understand how you could decide that hiding was the best thing to do. Sarah was silent, staring into her coffee cup. He could see how hard it was for Sarah. And his fatherly heart began to soften a little, but the wound was still too fresh. Sarah, I can't promise that I can accept this, but I want to know the whole truth, he said. Thank you, Dad. Kaya, that's more than I expected, she replied. John couldn't avoid talking to Michael for long. They had been friends for over 20 years, and despite the betrayal, he wanted to hear his explanation. Meet me in the park tomorrow. The place where we always went fishing, John said over the phone. Thanks, John. I'll be there, Michael replied. His voice sounded sincere, but John wasn't sure if it was true. At the next day, Michael showed up earlier than they had agreed. He was waiting by the bench where they used to discuss their life plans. Hi, John, he said when he approached. Michael, let's not drag this out. I want to know why you decided to hide all this from me. John began bluntly. Michael took a deep breath and began to speak. John, you were like a brother to me. I never planned for something like this to happen. But feelings are not something you can control. Feelings. Is that your excuse? John interrupted him. No, it's not an excuse. It's just an explanation. At first, I helped Sarah because I saw how much she needed support. But over time, it became something more, Michael said. And you didn't even think about what it would look like for me. You hit everything, Michael, John said, his voice rising. I was afraid of losing our friendship. I was afraid you would never understand, Michael replied. I know you feel betrayed, but you have to know that it wasn't easy for me. I spent a long time trying to convince myself that it was wrong, Michael said. And what changed? John asked sharply. Love, John. I fell in love with Sarah. And I know it sounds selfish, but I couldn't ignore it, Michael replied. Michael's words sounded sincere. John could see him trying to explain his motives, but it didn't take away the pain. Michael, you've always been someone I could rely on. But now I don't know if I can trust you, John said. I'm not asking you to forgive me now. I just want you to know the truth, Michael said. Michael put his hand on John's shoulder. You were and still are an important part of my life, and if there's anything I can do to make it right, I will, he said. John was silent, looking at the water in the lake. After talking to Michael, John felt even more confused. His thoughts were circling around what he had said, but there were things that did not give him peace of mind. Something doesn't add up, John thought. He decided to talk to Sarah again, but this time to be more direct. John invited his daughter to his house to discuss the situation without Michael. Sarah, I want you to answer my questions honestly, he said as they sat down in the kitchen. Dad, I'm not hiding anything, she replied, but her voice sounded uncertain. How long was Michael more than just my father's friend to you? John asked bluntly. Sarah looked down. About a year and a half, she admitted. You know how hard it was for me after I lost my job. Michael supported me, and he helped me find myself, and then it just became something more, she said. But why didn't you tell me? John asked. Because we were afraid you wouldn't understand, and now I see that we were right, she said. Why now? What else do I need to know? He insisted. Sarah took a deep breath. Dad, there's one more thing. Michael helped me financially. I took the money you once left me and used it to start over, she said. You mean use the money I left you for your future? John asked. Yes, and I know it doesn't seem right, but Michael also helped me so that I could grow, Sarah said. This was a new blow to John. He now realized that his relationship with Michael was not only emotionally dependent, but also financially dependent. At that that moment, the doorbell rang. It was Michael. All I came because we all need to talk together, he said as he entered the house. John didn't want to, but he agreed. John, I know it looks like I'm taking advantage of you, but I wasn't. I just wanted to help Sarah, Michael said. Help. You think helping means keeping the truth from me? John was outraged. We didn't mean to hurt you. But we did, Michael said. John realized that things were not as simple as they seemed. But was Michael sincere, or was it just another manipulation? After the conversation with Sarah and Michael, John sat in his living room, staring at an old family photo. It was a picture of all of him, Sarah as a little girl, and his late wife. This photo has always been a symbol of family unity for him, but now everything he knew seemed like a lie. Do I have the right to condemn them for their feelings? John thought, but do they have the right to betray me the way they did? John decided to talk to his neighbor Judith, who had always been his moral support. John, sometimes people make mistakes, Judith said as she poured him some tea. Mistakes? It's not just a mistake, Judith. They knew how I would react, so they hid the truth, John replied. But do you really want to lose your daughter over this? She asked. John thought about it. He knew that he loved Sarah more than anything, but his anger was still there. John began to analyze his feelings. He felt betrayed, but he also knew that continuing the conflict could destroy his relationship with Sarah forever. I've always taught her to be honest. But how can I accept that when she couldn't even tell me the truth? He said to himself. John decided to meet with Michael again, but this time in a more relaxed atmosphere. Michael, I want to know one thing. Did you ever think that this could ruin our friendship? John asked. John, it was the hardest decision I've ever made. I knew I could lose you, but I also knew that I couldn't ignore my feelings for Sarah, Michael replied. John realized that the problem was deeper than he thought. He began to doubt his ability to trust people, even those he had known for decades. If I can't trust you, Michael, who can I trust? He said. Michael looked down. I realize that I have lost your trust, but I'm willing to do anything to get it back, he replied. When John returned home, he decided to take a walk. He walked along familiar streets, remembering moments when his life seemed easier. Maybe I'm holding on to a past that no longer exists, he thought. John decided it was time to say what he was feeling. He invited Sarah and Michael to his home. This was to be the final conversation that would determine their future. We need to clear this up once and for all, John said as they sat down in his living room. Sarah looked anxious, and Michael tried to remain calm, but his eyes were clearly excited. You were both the closest people to me, John began. Michael, you were my best friend, and Sarah was my only daughter. And now I feel like I've lost both of you. Sarah sighed, her eyes filling with tears. Dad, I know we hurt you, but I love Michael, she said. John, I never wanted it to be like this. But you need to know that I love Sarah as much as you do, Michael said. You do. Is that an excuse? John raised his voice. Love doesn't give you the right to betray those who trust you. Dad, we were afraid of how you would react. That's why we kept it a secret. But now I see that you could never accept us, Sarah said through her tears. Moe, maybe if you had told me the truth in the beginning, I would have been able to understand, John replied. But now I don't know if I can forgive you. John, I want you to know that this is not just a relationship. We want to build a future together, Michael said. A future? What about our past, Michael? John looked him straight in the eye. Michael lowered his head. If you really want to be together, I can't stop you. But I need to know one thing. Are you willing to lose me for this? John asked. Sarah and Michael were silent. The room fell silent. John could feel his heart pounding. His question hung in the air, and every second seemed like an eternity. Dad, I don't want to lose you. But I can't lose Michael either, Sarah finally said. Then I'll try to find the strength to understand you, John said after a long pause, but it won't be easy. A month passed after that intense conversation. John tried to adjust to the new reality. He no longer avoided Sarah and Michael, but communication remained cold. Every time Sarah called, John picked up the phone, but their conversations were short. He didn't know how to talk to her like he used to. One day Sarah came to her father's house unannounced. "Dad, I know you're still angry, but I want you to know that you will always be the most important person to me," she said. John was silent, but her words touched him. "I'm trying, Sarah, but it's not as easy as you think," he replied. Michael also made an attempt to improve the relationship. He invited John to dinner to talk privately. "John, I realize that trust won't be restored overnight, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right," he said. "This isn't just about trust, Michael. It's about losing a friend and a fatherly relationship with my daughter at the same time," John replied. That night, John sat in his chair for a long time, looking at pictures of his family. He knew that time could not be turned back, but he also realized that life goes on. Maybe this is a test to teach me something more, he thought. A few weeks later, Sarah called John with important news. "Dad, Michael and I have decided to get married officially, and I want you to be there," she said. John had mixed emotions. On the one hand, he didn't want to be involved. On the other hand, he didn't want to lose his daughter forever. "I'll think about it, Sarah, but I promise I'll get back to you," he said. He didn't know yet if he could go, but his heart told him that it would be an important step toward reconciliation. John thought about what had happened for a long time. He realized that it would be difficult to fully forgive. But is it worth keeping your pride if it means losing your loved ones? Life after betrayal has no easy answers, but everyone has to decide for themselves whether forgiveness is worth the chance for a new beginning. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to leave your feedback and subscribe to the channel. Your opinions are important to us.